memories of her children. My own girl, Nuffer, from this time she was a little girl mother, loved her Father in heaven and was exceedingly grateful for the many wonderful blessings that he had given her, her family, and all of mankind. She also felt that he loved her and approved of most of the things that she did. Because of this, she was continually striving to please him, her parents, siblings, teachers, and those she admired and loved. This led her to fairly consistent good behavior, which, taken with her unusual beauty, gave her a considerable advantage among her peers and with adults. Very early in life, she became aware of the spiritual part of her being and developed it so that she felt her prayers were heard, and that when things got really tough, she could count on very personal spiritual comfort from those she loved and from the Lord. In her journal entries and in the contributions by her family to this publication, several examples of this aspect of her life are mentioned. She was a beautiful child, a charming teenager, and a very attractive woman with an especially good attitude. One glance at the picture of her 8th grade school class, and there is no doubt who Camille Cole was. Her hair was well groomed, her clothing neat and attractive, and she gave the impression of attentive interest in what was going on about her. She was blessed with an abundance of special gifts, and she knew it and decided early in life to use them to do good things in her world and to please those she loved in the Lord. I never knew her to use them for unrighteous purposes. One of these gifts was her optimism. She did not want to see the ugly things of this world. She knew they were there, but she would not let them spoil her view of life or the happiness of each day. She saw beauty and wondrous things in God's creations on a daily basis. She tells in her journal, as also mentioned by family members in this memoir, that as a little girl she thought that he had created them all just for her to enjoy, and how amazed, not jealous, she was to discover that he had actually done it for all of his children who he deeply loved. She saw beauty and found great joy in every leaf, cloud, pebble, insect, bird, etc. Her strength came from the fact that she saw the good in everything and refused to acknowledge or accept the impact of the ugly in her life. The great tragedy of her life was when she discovered as a teenager that her parents, both of whom she dearly loved, were not compatible. Her mother, who was once described by her husband, Myron, as nearest thing to an angel he had ever seen, and her father, who was a very likable and good man, had some irresolvable difference between them. She did not blame either of them or act out, as many teenagers do, but instead tried even harder to please them both in hopes that her love and kindness would bring them together again. The reader may be pleased to know that she was happy to realize this dream when her mother, a few days before her death, told her that she'd seen her father, who was waiting for her in a place where the vagaries of human behavior would not interfere with their loving relationship. Camille kept all these things to herself and went on being the charming person that we all knew and loved so much. Mother loved and admired good men and honored them in their righteousness as she did her own father and her brothers. She often overlooked their faults as she did her own. She knew that she could have a great influence upon them, and she often used this to achieve what she considered righteous purposes. I never knew her to flirt or entice them in any way, but she always had their attention. Dad knew this all along and was not threatened by it. He was exceptionally proud of her and happy to be part of her life. She also loved and admired good women who she felt were equal to, or perhaps a little better than men, and therefore were more obligated to behavior, because they were responsible for the advancement of good in mankind. She had a special disdain for and was quite unforgiving women who used their way with men to attain their selfish ends. She had many women friends, but was very selective about who she associated with. She had a special affection for children who she viewed as the most important members of the human race. I often heard her tell Dad that if ever it came to who was most important to consider when making a decision about things in life, the children always must come first. Then Dad, and finally her. She would say that he and she had their great joys in life, and now it was the children's turn. Now was her time. Her talent for poetry was not all that uncommon in her time. Many young people of her day were good at it because it was a popular way of romantic, joyful, and sorrowful expression. Her special gift was in the way she used it to lift up her own and her family's spirits by it. Her mother and grandmother, as well as her sister Mabel, all were good at poetry and prose and took much pleasure in it. She and Mabel had a special and happy relationship with each other and with their respective spouses. Mother and Dad and Aunt Mabel and Uncle Ralph Hillam got together often for hilarious conversation and other social interactions. I never heard them argue. However, they were both fanatical about keeping important secrets from each other. It was some sort of game they played all their lives. She just about worshipped her older brother Frank, who she saw as tall, dark, and handsome, and she was deeply saddened by his tragic life and death. She had lots of fun with her second brother, Clifford, who was a great social one entertainer, and also had a tragic death while working on the Utah electric power line. She enjoyed her younger brother Glenn because he was so charming and friendly. We children used to enjoy it when the Cole uncles got together. They had such a great time laughing and joking continuously. Early one summer morning, when I was about 8 years old, Mother dressed in nice-looking slacks, unusual for women to wear in those days. And we went out on the front lawn just after Dad had cut the grass, which had become so tall that it was about ready for hay. She collected some green poplar sticks, wire, twine, large safety pins, etc. And together we built a fully functional miniature scale model. Hay derrick complete with Jackson pulley, swivel, and cable. With it we were able to build our own little haystacks just like Dad's. I am still amazed that she was able to do all that without any help from Dad. And Mother sometimes brought cold drinks out to the field for Dad and whoever was working with him. On one particularly hot day in August, she brought out a 2-quart jar of home-bottled Concord grape juice, which had been cooled in the basement. It was delicious, and we drank with great gusto. She took what was left back to the house for her. In a short time, she came hurriedly back to the field and informed us that there must have been something wrong with the grape juice, because when she gave it to Beth, within a few minutes, she abruptly, without warning, vomited the whole of it all over the kitchen. There had not been enough left for Mother, so she was okay. We said that we were all feeling just fine. Suddenly, and without warning Dad, the hired man and I were convulsed with nausea, and we scattered grape juice all over that field. It came about quickly, almost without pain, and completely without any control. When it was all over, we did not feel much effect, just empty stomachs, a bit lighter, much humbled. We went on with our work, and Mother went back to the house vowing to never ever bottle Concord grape juice again. I've often wondered what kind of microbe that was and how it ever got into Mother's grape juice. She was able to do all that without any help from Dad. In the early years, we did not have much music in our home, even though Grandma Cole loved to play the piano and sing with us kids. Mother and Dad were just struggling so hard to keep things going that they did not have much time for such things. However, just before the Depression, they did purchase a brand new graphophone that you had to crank to wind up like a clock spring, which played 55 RPM records with one song on each side. Their favorite was the song Ramona, sung by Gene Austin, with lyrics by L. Wolf Gilbert and music by Mabel Wayne. It was from the accompaniment to the old movie by that name and was very romantic. On the flip side of the record was the tune called Abdul the Bulbul Amir or something like that. It told these two warriors who fought all night by the light of the silver moon. And we played the records until we wore them out. Later I named my prize-winning registered Holstein show Bull Abdul. One day during the Depression, early 30s, Dad took the family on a trip up Strawberry Canyon above Mink Creek, and he found a campsite where he and Mother had visited when they were dating, and he was teaching school in Mink Creek. There's a large aspen tree with the letters MDM, low CC, and an artistic heart carved in its white bark. They really had lots of fun together. I went back there when I was in high school, but not been able to find it again because the state improved the road up the canyon. however, this summer, 2003. I did find the tree standing among others with more recent carvings of love, but it was deteriorated until it was just a stump with a few irregular marks on it. Last year before she died was not a happy time for her. The negative things of life seemed determined to overcome her, and she hated it. She did not want to be that little old lady all shriveled up with osteoporosis and dependent on others. She had not planned to live till I was beyond 80 years, and could not understand why the Lord would not let her die while she was still a handsome woman, and yet she continued to the end to put the best face on what she had, being continually grateful and outwardly cheerful. In her writings last year, she repeatedly mentions her struggles to keep her faith strong. She said to me privately, "Girl, why can't I just die now and get it all over with?" I told her somewhat facetiously that she was being kept alive by her medicines, and if she would just stop taking her antibiotics against infection, her oxygen at night, and her diuretics to keep fluid away from her heart, she would die. Well, she took that seriously and tried it without telling anyone about it. It worked only too well, but she was alone. And when she got short of breath, she became frightened and called the ambulance to take her to the hospital, where they put her back on everything, and she recovered, much to her disgust. For some months she had been watching with much concern and fear of a small sore on her nose that would not heal. Her fear was that it was a cancer. She could not even say the word cancer because of her great fear of the malady. She had an aunt who years before had a similar lesion, which the doctors determined was cancerous, so they operated and removed a considerable portion, the end of her nose, disfiguring her. Mother was deathly afraid of this happening to her, so she hid it from Dr. Stone. When he did see it, he sent her to a specialist who promptly operated to remove it. She was advised that it was indeed malignant and that they could not get it all, and she would probably die from it. She talked with her doctor, and he told her he could take her off her medicines and give her something to make her comfortable, and she would die peacefully in a few days. He did, and she was gone in 4 days. She was a remarkable woman who had the courage and determination to maintain her faith and good cheer to the very end. She found much happiness, and the world was a better place because of her. Margaret McGregor, Nuffer daughter-in-law, taken from a letter written to Mother on Mother's Day. Margaret wanted to include this in any tribute that would be written to Mother. She may not have been the author, but it expressed her gratitude.
To his mother. Author unknown. Mother-in-law, they say, and yet somehow I simply can't forget. 'Twas you who watched his baby ways, who taught him his first hymn of praise, who smiled on him with loving pride when he first toddled by your side. Mother-in-law. But oh, 'twas you who taught him to be kind and true. When he was tired, almost asleep, 'twas to your arms he used to creep, and when he bruised his tiny knee, 'twas you who kissed it tenderly. Mother-in-law, they say, and yet, somehow I never shall forget how very much I owe to you, who taught him how to grow. You trained your son to look above, you made of him the man I love, and so I think of that today. Ah, then with thankful heart, I'll say our mother.
Camille Neuffer Carter.
Mother was born to parents who were descendants of staunch English immigrants who arrived in New York City about 1840. Her memories of her childhood were very dear to her. She loved the outdoors, felt that God had made the flowers, fields, and all beautiful things especially for her. Remember well the magic of springtime everywhere. In childhood's sweet enchantment, I worshipped everything, each bud and flower and tree, and knew that God had made them, especially for me. So went the days of my childhood and young girlhood. Each day was filled with excitement, wonder, and awe. I wonder even to this day why Mother did not become cross with me for spending so much time out of doors. But she had a great understanding of human nature and knew, I am sure, of my great love for the fields, flowers, and trees. Summertime was an ecstatic joy for me. I was never lonely. I had the fields to dream in, trails to explore, songbirds to listen to, the wind and rain to touch my face. At these times it seemed that God was very near. He was my friend. Evening was a magic time in this peaceful valley of sunrise, sunset, fragrant fields, and gentle people. Stars hung like millions of flicker-ing lanterns on summer nights, and in the winter snow swirled in white gusts, leaving weird shapes and patterns on the fences and buildings. Mother was an excellent housekeeper. She loved to have freshly laundered curtains and the smell of clean clothes brought in from the clothesline. Yearly she and Dad would get out the large tub, mix up a batch of calcimine, and together proceed to cover the inside walls of the house with a fresh new coat of color. Cooking was a great delight to her. Upon arriving home from school after a long, tiring and weary day, we jumped from the old school bus and knew there would always be a warm supper to greet us. She loved to make chocolate fudge in the long winter evenings for Dad and her children. Saturdays were a day for cleaning and doing chores on the farm. The night before, Mother would put a large pan of white beans to soak. The next day for lunch we had the most delicious meal of boiled beans seasoned with butter, salt and pepper, and homemade bread with creamy white honey from Grandpa Nuffer's bees. 72. Mother loved to go on family picnics, down to Bear River to catch fish, which only she could fry crisp and brown to a wonderful taste. Many times we drove to Willow Flat and Franklin Basin for an overnight camp out with relatives and family friends. Mother made holidays special occasions for the family. Sandwiches, boiled and colored eggs, and candy were provided at Easter time to be packed in lunch bags, to be taken to the dry farms as we searched for the first buttercups and bluebells. Pumpkin pies made from garden-grown Hubbard squash, freshly butchered chickens with dressing, roasted, and always cranberry sauce and fruit salad were on the menu for Thanksgiving dinner. The especially happy times were when Gerald and Frank returned home unexpectedly for a short visit. Mother encouraged and made it possible for me to take piano lessons. In my early school years, every Saturday morning, Dad would saddle our pony Firefly, put me on, and I was off to Preston for a half-hour piano lesson with my teacher, Allie Packer. It cost 50 cents per lesson. I have highly appreciated and benefited from that gift from them to me. Mother was very proud of her heritage and sought for the best for her family. She had a great sense of God's influence in people's lives. She made sure that we had a blessing upon our daily meals, attended church, and taught us to kneel each evening in prayer. I feel that she has been a very positive influence in my life, giving me strength and determination to live my convictions. I love her very much for doing so.
In memory of Grandmother, eulogy for Camille Cole Nuffer. Garth Neuffer for his father.
These are remarks I delivered for Grandmother's memorial service, but I think they read just as appropriate for the celebration of her 100th birthday, which brings us together in her remembrance once again. We are brought together here today in both joy and sorrow. Sorrow for someone who we all loved and missed dearly, but also joy for the celebration of someone who had an indomitable spirit and zest for living. We all have our wonderful memories of Grandmother. I can still remember the smell of her rhubarb pie, the taste of her homemade chokecherry jelly, the delicious caramels and divinities she made for us every Christmas, her love of poetry and the sense of beauty and grace she brought to the world. And I remember how much she loved to bring us all together at our family reunions. She loved her family, and there was a lot to love. Grandmother kidded John and me when we visited her in Missouri, while she was staying with Gerald and Margaret. We told her we had gone forth into the world, but were still working on the multiplying part. She said, "Well, boys, you've got a lot of catching up to do." She was so proud of all her children and grandchildren. Most of all, I remember what a wonderful sense of humor she had. I can still hear that warm, spirited chuckle she had when she laughed. I remember one family reunion, and we all have plenty of reunion stories, when Grandmother gently warned Robert against drinking too much of that great homemade root beer that was prepared in big vats and bubbled over dry ice for so many reunions. Well, of course, Robert had other ideas and guzzled the stuff with abandon, much to his regret. Poor Robert had root beer coming and going that day. Grandmother just chucked, "Now, Robert, I told you." Grandmother was always a source of great strength and wisdom for us. When I was just 4 or 5 years old and already headstrong -1, jumped into her car one day to accompany her to the store. She told me to make sure that I had closed and locked the car door. With typical Nuffer confidence, I said, "Of course, no problem." and around the first corner the car door swung wide open and I almost tumbled out. I grabbed onto her coat for dear life. She didn't get mad or cross, she just pulled over and calmly said, "Now Garth." I listened to her guidance and suggestions more closely after that. Grandmother was also a real free spirit and adventurer. She had a fondness for life that knew few bounds. She often ventured into the mountains on hikes with my father, whom she loved dearly. My mother related a story to me about one of these hikes where grandmother spied a bluebird sitting in a tree, and said that was what she wished she could be, so she could lose her earthly bonds and fly free. Well, she's done that now. She's flown to a better place. But once again, she has brought us all together to remember and cherish her indomitable spirit and joy for life. We all loved her and miss her dearly. But she will always be with us, in our hearts and in our spirits. We love you, Grandmother, always.
Vicky Goodsell, Nuffer daughter-in-law.
One morning, during the last summer that Mother stayed with us in Bozeman, she asked me for something to read. I remember suggesting several books by writers that she had enjoyed in the past, but she said she wanted something with more depth, with more meaning. She finally selected the writings of John Muir, and from then on she would call to tell me about an incident in his life, or to read a passage of his that she particularly liked. After her funeral I found a book that I had sent her, The Wilderness World of John Muir, among her belongings on the table on Beth's back porch. It was well worn by then, and held together by a rubber band. On the way home I opened it and read in her handwriting, "I love this book." She had underlined sentences and paragraphs that appealed to her, and made notations in the margins of the pages. For 2 or 3 years after she died my first thought was to call her when I came across something striking in a book or in nature. It took me a few seconds to remember that she was gone. She loved nature all of her life. Her writings are filled with descriptions of sunsets, and flowers, and cicadas singing in the evening. She taught me to notice and appreciate the first tiny violet on the floor of the grove in Montana, and through her writings to love, as she did, the astonishment of finding a simple object of unexpected beauty. I will never forget how Mother's face lit up when Kelly, at 5, gave her a small bouquet of wildflowers that she had picked for her on the hill behind our cabin.
Lovingly compiled by Joan Marilyn Nuffer Christ.
Camille Cole Neuffer had a rendezvous with nature. Through her eyes we, her family, saw the intricate beauty and wonders that God had designed for our joy. Mother wrote, "My aspen meadows are lovely as ever, lighted at intervals with mischievous rays of vagabond sunshine turning the aspens to pale gold. I grew up in a world of magic, of dreams, of quietness, of beauty, of peace, and a time of wonder. My heart was in my father's fields teeming with bird song. Look at the growing plants sucking the air and sunshine for sustenance. My world was not born in agony but into God's creation." 1942. This is the year that I began my intimate knowledge of Mother. I was quite an unexpected addition to her family, with Gerald, 20, Beth, 17, Frank 14, and Paul 9 years old. She was at the social peak of her life as she had been elected the president of the Daughters of the Idaho Pioneers. Dad and Mother were living on the farm SW of Preston, ID. She remembered the house and area, a simple comfortable white frame home with a large lilac tree snuggled close to the back door where the children and their dog would often be found sleeping. The fields were set in neat checkerboard squares and the road was lined with Lombardy poplars. The ditch bank along the road grew asparagus and watercress that often reached the dinner able. 1944. Mother published a book of poetry, Down Happiness Road. She was her own agent as she sent her book to church dignitaries, prominent poets she admired, and to college professors. Her correspondence with them came from New Guinea, the eastern United States, and California. They were full of praise. They asked her to critique their poems and her opinion on how to publish them. Mom would often be asked to give book readings. I heard people comment that she had a very impressive delivery. 1946. When we moved to Ogden, UT, the polio epidemic was rampant. She was very cautious with her children and ensured that I wore stockings on my feet at all times, even in the swimming pool. No one knew at the time what caused polio. 1950. I believe that the move to Bozeman, Mt. gave me further insight to a modern-day pioneer woman. Mother killed the chicken for dinner, milked a Jersey cow for the rich cream, warmed our beds with heated bricks and helped Dad build our new house on the ranch. She was a very capable, take charge, and adventuresome woman. Her home was an extension of her image. The example of being a principled hard worker and taking each day as it came made a strong impression on her children. Mother was very loyal to her family, always encouraging and promoting their well-being. How do I know this is true? Her children and grandchildren were constantly sending correspondence or calling her on the telephone. I remember 2 funny stories about Mom. One day she came in the house dripping with water from head to foot. With her fishing pole in hand and slough hat on her head, she told us the story of her fishing on the pond bank. The big fish pulled her right in the water. Mom and I would go to the pig pen with table scraps for about 10 pigs. She happened to climb over the tall fence and slipped right into the trough. I thought I had lost her. But she jumped back just as quickly. Mother was a very faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ. I believe that she attended all of her required weekly meetings. There were no daily decisions to make regarding her religion. She knew who she was. She was dedicated, just as the sun rises in the east each morning. 1961. Mother and Dad were asked by the LDS Church to serve a mission overseas. They wanted Dad to start a chapel in Germany. When we arrived they were not ready, so we were sent to Manchester, England. Mom and Dad were there for 3 years. Dad would go to work daily and Mom would take care of the ordering of materials and the socialization necessary to support Dad. We would travel via city buses and our experiences were varied. I was just reading a short story written by Mom regarding one of our constant companions in Europe. The Green Umbrella. I found you in a huge department store in Germany. How much you cost I do not know. I proffered a handful of money to the sales lady. I could not do otherwise, for she spoke no English and Elle spoke no German. That was the day I found a true friend. Little did either of us know what the days ahead would bring. We walked the stressful streets of Frankfurt searching desperately for American food. All we seemed to see were tall goblets of foaming beer and Wiener Schnitzels greasy. The screeching traffic bore down on us unmercifully. Somehow we escaped with our lives. We boarded a train for Hoheneufen, land of our ancestors, no conductors to tell us of our destination. A high feminine scream whistle echoed across green woods and strange villages, as we sped through the country sunlight. How we ever alighted at the right place is a mystery yet. Finally we boarded a jet for England. Later we walked through Epsom Downs, and even reluctantly entered a pub as we could find no cafe for lunch. Finally we took our last trip by rail to Manchester, our home for over 3 years. It was here you proved to be a true friend indeed. We rode the huge 2-story red buses, rain and shine. One day it was raining terrible, as only it can rain in England. We jumped a crowded bus. People were hunched together like wet chickens. The only place I could find for you as we sat down was right between my knees. As I was sitting there you dripped great drops of cold water down my legs. This made me shiver, but one did not blame you. We came to the end of our ride and the disembarking passengers were laughing at the bloody cold weather. One day later, we impatiently jumped from the bus and realized I had lost my pump, a high-heeled shoe. Leaping back to the bus I had to bend and reach over an occupant. The heel had caught in the narrow lines on the floor and with much urging, bending back and forth, almost lying on the lap of an occupant. The shoe released. Restoring it to my foot I rushed to the back door. The conductor smiled, as we climbed down the steps and said goodbye, "Ta, love." There were many days you stood silently in the hall corner waiting for me to recover from my homesickness for America. Every time I looked your way you beckoned for me to take a walk with you. 1964. Mother came to Downey, CA to help with the birth of my first son, Paul. She introduced me to motherhood. She showed me that bathing a new baby is not too traumatic. Mom set up a precedent of helping with each of her Tolman grandchildren, Paul, 1964, Eric, 1965, Holly Camille, 1969, Brent, 1971, and her last grandchild Jason, 1974. Mother was always available when we asked for her help. However, she never interfered with her children's personal affairs. 1974. Montana, July, 1974. Sunlight filters the curtains of sleepy people. The Bridger Mountains fold their arms around my placid green valley. Peace is here, an endless panorama of glory. Sunset hangs crimson curtains in the windows of the west. Fresh dawns. Air so invigorating one wants to shout to the world the joy of being alive. Behold it all. So goes life at the Nuffer hillside retreat. A huge yellow moon silhouetted for a brief moment on the rim of a mountain, flings a golden glow across my valley, then lifts into a deep blue sky. CCN. I am sitting in front of a glowing fireplace listening to the spit and crackle of burning logs. Autumn chill fills the air. The brooding rain clouds hang low. Fallow land resembles dark blankets or patches stretched over rolling hills. A crisp wind teases the aspens. A melancholy train whistles echoes as it slides through my valley. A hollyhock clustered with pink saucers sways bravely in the wind beside the balcony railing. The summer has been a flash of golden hours. The last guests have waved farewell from the lane. The swallows have flown south, the birdhouse seems forlorn. I feel a tinge of sadness. But another spring and summer shall come. 1976, Mother's sweetheart, MD as she often called him, of 58 years passed away. Soon after Dad's funeral, Mother felt his presence as she was sitting on her couch in Logan. This feeling gave Mother a true sense of well-being. Mom also believed in the power of prayer. After looking around my cozy dwelling, I suppose one would say I caress each thing with my eyes. Dear God, if I could see Frank and know that he is all right. Later, I have seen his countenance. Lovely to behold, strong and happy. This I know. 1979. Mother valued education. She enrolled in English 202 with Professor W.K. Brewer at the Utah State University. Mind you, she was 76 years of age. She was fearless. The schedule was quite rigorous to include writing various poems in the format prescribed by her teacher. Her favorite was called The Old Stove. It was juried in the Poetry Panorama, a book published by the Utah State Poetry Society in 1982. The Old Stove. It belched great gusts of strangling black smoke. Winds screamed eerily down its skinny chimney. Mama, coughing, face smudged, scraped buckets of soot and ashes from its dark insides. Polished its grimy face to a mirror, staining her hands jet black. A roaring giant, puffing and spitting, it chewed a fresh pine log. Yet on a wintry night, belly full, it slumbered gently, emitting sighs of contentment. Its open grate cast dancing shadows on the darkened walls. A child beside Papa's chair, I rubbed his back, combed hair, his delight at the end of day. And, wide-eyed, wonderingly one watched, the shadow ballet. Camille C. Neuffer. 1984. Mother married Joseph Lee Olson in 1984. He was a very kind, generous individual who helped Mother through some of her trying latter years. They would go to breakfast at Angle''S1, a local cafe, with her sis, Mabel, and Uncle Ralph. Their conversations would be peppered with laughter and great joy, the subject often centering on the foibles of being senior citizens. 1988. Mother had Beth and Mark live with her in the Logan house. They helped her as that dreaded disease osteoporosis took hold of Mom's body frame. Getting older and more fragile took a toll on Mother and Lee's relationship. They parted ways as the best of friends. All of us visited with Mom weekly and shared her loving companionship. I can honestly say she was one of my best friends. A woman I greatly admired. When Mother lay dying in the Logan hospital, one of our family members, Barbara, her granddaughter, arrived just after she had picked some red raspberries at Bear Lake. She offered them to Mom, one at a time. I think it was fitting that such a beautiful woman who took so much joy and satisfaction from nature should pass away with fresh raspberries as her last meal.
Memories of her grandchildren, Myra and Dave Neuffer, huh?
When I think of Grandma, I always smell fresh baked bread. And then I remember churning homemade butter. Oh, how sweet the two were together. Then there was the bread drawer. What a treat it was to pull some bread out of there and spread some of her butter on it. A few days old, and it was still good. In 1952, I spent the summer with Grandma and Grandpa. During that time, she told me that men, yes, she used the term men, and how grown-up that made me feel, needed to be able to cook for themselves and their family. Then she proceeded to have me help with at least one meal a day, including how to clean, cook, and season whatever she had on the menu. That same summer, she was taking down the laundry before the rain came and was struck by lightning. It shook her up some, but did not slow her down. Grandma was a true patriot and expressed the view that if you didn't like living in the USA, then you should leave, and leave quickly. I will never forget how she could motivate Paul to play the violin. Whenever no one else could get him to do it, she always found a way to make him feel like he was doing it just to please her. And of course, he really was. In 1973, on our way to Grandma's, we stopped by Bridger Canyon and picked over a quart of huckleberries to take to Grandma as a surprise for her and Grandpa. While we were walking around with Grandpa, Grandma turned those huckleberries into the best cobbler I have ever tasted. Told her that we had picked them for her, not for us. And she said that huckleberries were meant to share and were best fresh, so who else to share them with than some of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren?
John Gerald Nuffer.
There are numerous memories about Grandmother Neuffer. Many of them center around her poise, ladylike charm, and almost a hint of regality. Sometimes I almost laugh when I think of her. But that was Camille. She had a mischievous sense of adventure, and a chuckle to go with it. I loved hearing her laugh and always looked forward to visiting with her. It made little difference when we visited, invariably nature would enter into the discussion. Nature was woven into her being. The birds, flowers, sense of the outdoors, clouds, trees, etc., were reflected in her poetry. Her poetry was thoughtful, reflective, inspirational and witty. Janelle and I went to visit grandmother's sister, Mabel Killam, following grandmother's passing. I had not seen Mabel for years. We chatted and laughed and reacquainted ourselves. It became apparent that Camille and Mabel shared the same love of nature that grandmother wrote about in her poetry. I asked Mabel how it was that she and Camille shared this same love for nature. Mabel told Janelle and I that when they were young, that her father, Robert Franklin Cole, would load up the wagon with fresh hay, just as full as it could be loaded, hitch up the horses, load the wagon with food and bedding, and they would ride up into the mountains, camp out under the stars, and stay until the hay for the horses was running out. Just imagine. Nothing clamoring for attention but nature and family. Simply beautiful. I can envision those wagon rides to and from those special times in God's creation, and thank grandmother for sharing it with us in her poetry.
Grandma and Grandpa, the Louis Dale Neuffer years.
My first memories of Myron David and Camille Cole Neuffer are, as one might expect, vague and sporadic. They are pleasant and most enjoyable to reflect upon, and as I think of them I find that the memories are, if not credible, at least incredible and mysterious. Therein is the excitement. As a small boy I recall a visit to the farm in Bozeman, the old farmhouse near the gravel road and tracks below the newer A-frame which Grandpa built in later years. The grandparents were friendly, adult types who briskly shooed me and Greg, I think, out the back door of the farmhouse into a fenced yard. Straight out back, across the yard, and outside the fence was a chicken coop sited near a small stream. Am I even close? Well, I think it was there, and some uncle, Paul or Frank, encouraged Greg and I to chase the chickens, catch them and put them into crates, something about selling them. What fun that was, also what fun it was to follow that uncle into the coop across the driveway, to the right going out the back door of the farmhouse, and watch him select a chicken, take it out to a stump in the yard in front of a shed and whack off with its head. Finally, I understood the Queen in Alice in Wonderland. Still later, at age 8, we headed in our newly painted, pea green, Old Plymouth for Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and that vast, wild, foreboding wilderness region known as the West, a place especially viewed by a schoolboy from Missouri as teeming with redskins ready to SCA body at any moment. So I was quite surprised when we pulled up in front of Grandma's new house, on a hill looking east from Bozeman, very much in the city, that everyone was not wearing chaps, breechcloths, and guns. I was even more surprised when Greg, who had gone west earlier with the Hardmans and the Gregory Neuffer keeper-inner, recognized our newly painted car the second we pulled into Grandma's driveway. I was astonished as Grandma pulled out a toy train for me to play with which had been Uncle Paul's. I couldn't believe that they could still have something so old, from so long ago, when Paul was a boy, still hanging around the house in a toy box. Grandma was the best cook. Those cinnamon rolls and other goodies, That one round cinnamon roll, like a bundt cake with cherries all on top, was the neatest pastry I had ever seen, and I was sure Grandma had made it just for me. And when I tasted it, I knew it was. I was so excited at that time to know that Grandma and Grandpa were about to go on a mission, especially as carpenters, to build chapels. I was determined then to also be a carpenter. It was also then that John and David decided to hike from Grandma's house to Uncle Mark's house in Bridger Canyon. It looked like the way they went was straight over a mountain. I couldn't imagine anyone hiking that far. But they did it, and when we drove to Uncle Mark's house that afternoon, I was even more impressed. During that reunion, I recall riding with Grandpa in his car down the main street in Bozeman and asking where all of the Indians were. Grandpa laughed and showed me some, walking down the sidewalk. I said, "Where?" He just replied, "There." And I had missed them. So he showed me the next bunch. I just couldn't figure it out, 'cause as far as I could tell, there were just a bunch of normal people there shopping. Grandpa chuckled softly and explained that nowadays, Indians dressed pretty much like everyone else and only went on the warpath occasionally. Well, I guess he figured that I was interested, 'cause later that week he took a bunch of us to see the biggest pack of bloody, hair-scalping savages on the warpath that ever rode the Oregon Trail in a movie by the same name. I think I hid my face in his lap for 3/4 of the show. That reunion was full of other memories also, like catching 80+ trout at the creek in Bridger Canyon, Uncle Paul in a bearskin, the dog that would sick him, David shooting Paul's shotgun, bows and arrows, horses, and many other fun things. Finally, I remember the photograph session in front of Grandma's house, where Uncle Paul and her Frank stood in front of the family and made everyone laugh until the photographer was ready. I thought they were really funny. Well, the years after that went quickly while Grandma and Grandpa were on their mission to Germany and England. I was excited for them to return, and glad when they did. I don't remember very clearly the time they spent in Iowa building chapels and when they lived with us in Columbia and also lived in Topeka, Kansas. I do remember that they lived in the green apartments on Highway 63, and Grandpa was called as the branch genealogy representative for the Columbia, Missouri branch. Also, I remember riding with him in an old car or truck which had turn signals that stuck, and I always had to remind him to turn off the signal after the turn in the road, because he couldn't hear the blinking noise. I remember visits and dinners at those homes, but they were boring times for a young boy, being cooped up in small apartments, compared to Montana, so Grandpa would always take me for a ride in the car, probably to save Grandma. Also, it seems like it always rained on those days we went for visits. I remember that Grandpa used my bedroom in the basement while they stayed with us. Grandma slept upstairs since Grandpa's snoring was a bit loud. Grandpa took me to work on a house being built by the church for the Pauling family. I went along to help like any martyred teenager, and filled holes in the woodwork. Wow! Some way to spend the afternoon, and I felt really put out until Grandpa paid me $3 whole, a lot in those days when a soda was only a nickel. Suddenly, I came to life and was all kinds of help. "Sure, Grandpa, and any other time you need help, just let me know." However, he never needed my help again, which might explain why I never became a carpenter. I think it had something to do with skill level. He probably had to refill and resand all the holes I did, but he never said a word. He sure was a patient and loving grandfather. I remember that Grandpa always liked to drive and look at the countryside. I liked to do that also and always enjoyed going with him. I remember when the state took his driver's license, I knew and understood a little how he felt, to have his wings clipped and be virtually tied down. Often I cried when I considered how much he loved to roam and was unable to do so. Prior to his stroke, I visited him and Grandma at Logan, and instead of going for a drive, he took me for a walk, saving Grandma again, and though the walk was enjoyable, I could see how limited his lifestyle had become as he made his regular trip to the Logan library to look at a newspaper or book. He had newspapers at home but just needed to get out and about. I remember how strong I thought Grandpa was. Anyone who could even hold a heavy hammer, like the 2.5-pound claw hammer he worked with every day, all day, had to be strong. That is how I remember him, strong, quiet, somber and full of love. I always thought he was solid rock, yet he smiled and chuckled often. He loved to gently tease me, and even marry, when we became engaged. He always did things to get us grandchildren out from under Grandma's feet. I know he loved her 'cause he was always protecting her from the hustle and bustle of noisy grandkids. It was a sobering drive that fall day in 1973 as Mom and Dad and I headed west from Salt Lake City toward Lovelock, Nevada. We had received word that Grandma had been involved in a serious motor vehicle accident and was hospitalized, condition unstable. As we met Grandpa outside the hospital, he related the circumstances behind the accident. Grandma was driving their car, he was following in their truck. Grandma's car suddenly went out of control, went off the road and overturned, one or more times. In my mind, I saw him driving the truck and watching his eternal partner engage in a nearly fatal accident. I knew that as he helplessly watched, he was crying Camille, and struggling through fear and emotion to maintain control of his own vehicle. I knew that he screeched his truck to a stop and haltingly ran and stumbled to her side. I knew that he loved her and would for eternity. When we finally visited with Grandma in that quiet hospital room and saw her injured and weakened state, we felt joy to know that she was still with us and with him. Even with her injuries and potential heart problems, she still smiled and quietly laughed at her situation. She commented on her raccoon-like blackened eyes. What a sight she was. My skin crawled as it had when I first saw my brother David many years earlier after his near-fatal car accident in Mexico. Missouri. Grandma was a champ and she scolded Dad for having a mother who couldn't keep a car on the road. Sort of like the time when she scolded Barbara for getting bitten by a tree, remember Barb? It was also during that visit to Nevada when I learned, while sitting in a restaurant with Grandpa, Dad, Uncle Paul, and maybe Uncle Frank, why Neuffers don't ever mix reunions with politics. I never made that mistake again. And so finally they settled in Logan. It was nice to be able to visit them there, especially while I was in school at Provo. I can't figure out how as a grown adult, I still broke Grandma's furniture. I mean, I only sat in that recliner rocker and presto. What do you know, kindling. I think Grandma used to put her nice things away whenever I visited, just in case. You know? Come to think of it, Mom used to do that too. I always enjoyed Grandma's dry humor and wit. I'm sure she had more on the ball than a dozen congressmen and could have outwitted the Speaker of the House on his best day, in her sleep. I know there is so much more to remember that I haven't. Each time we review the memories, they are less clear and clouded by other events. I can see the value of keeping journals. I suppose in some respects, Grandma and Grandpa were like royalty, which we revered, honored, and respected. I see them as a king and a queen, and I am thankful to have been and still be a part of their kingdom.
And the Nuffer Jason.
What I remember about Grandma Neuffer is that everything about her was beautiful. She had a beautiful name, she dressed beautifully, she spoke beautifully, and everything I associate with her is something beautiful and precious to me. I was always so jealous of my cousins who got to spend summer months with Grandma and Grandpa. That magical attic room in the A-frame in Bozeman seemed a princess tower to me, and while Grandpa was certainly the biggest, bravest, and wisest man on the earth, Grandma knew all the secrets of home and the kitchen, and was equally as heroic to me. The scent of mint tea and the secret hiding places for special treats were part of the mystique of her kitchen. The way she knew her caramels were done by the way the candy slid off the wooden spoon was another unfathomable skill. I remember Grandma teaching me to crochet, which I never did learn very well. I was better at mirroring her instructions than following them, and so to this day I crochet left-handed, because I couldn't turn things around in my head to do it right-handed, as she did. I loved to curl up in the Afghan she made for our family. I remember the sound of her chuckle, and the gentle, quick way she would tease her children and grandchildren. Her wit was so quick, you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. I remember how much everyone loved to be around her. She was like a queen bee at the reunions, laughing at one of Paul or Frank's jokes, visiting with her daughters and daughters-in-law, hugging the grandchildren, working in the kitchen and shooing the little ones outdoors. On those rare, quiet occasions when I wasn't shooed out the door to enjoy the beauty there, I loved to look at all the beautiful things inside her house, the trinkets and treasures she had collected in England and the lovely things she had made with her own hands. Most of all, it was so clear to me how much she adored her children and grandchildren. I always knew I was part of something special because I was part of her family.
Memories of Grandma Pam. Rootsell.
My first memory of Grandma shows her thoughtfulness of her grandchildren. Being a preschooler, I had ridden in with my mother to Grandma's house to pick up a pair of shoes. Grandma was gone when we got there, but she had left some candy in the shoes for me. My brothers and sisters and I would take turns going to Grandma's house after Sunday school until sacrament meeting in the evening. It was always a treat to get to go. I remember that she often had ice cream for us, a real treat in those days. Later, as a student at Utah State University far from my own family, I loved to go see Grandma and Grandpa in their home in Logan. She would often make a tasty meal for me. It was always the best food, simple, but so delicious. She always made me feel special, as she would listen to me intently and be very excited about whatever was going on in my life. I can see that she passed many of those qualities on to my mother. How grateful I am that she raised her and taught her to be such a wonderful mother.
Karen Carter.
One of my clearest memories of Grandma is when she and Grandpa came and lived in tent sleep, viewing with us for a few months while Grandpa helped my dad build our new house. I also remember their little A-frame house in Bozeman and visiting them there. I enjoyed Grandma's humor, intelligence and appreciation of culture and beauty. I felt like I really got to know her best through reading her poems and life story. I feel a real appreciation for the qualities she sent down to me through my mother and the good heritage I have from her.
Holly Carter Compton.
My memories of Grandma Nuffer were of when she was older. She always wore hose, heels, and colorful clothes. She was always dressed up according to standards of today. Her hair was always done up beautifully. She always had rose milk in her bathroom when I visited. I remember visiting her in Logan with my mom and dad. She made raisin pie for us. That was the first time I had tasted it. I also remember her English lavender and yellow rose bushes. Her room had rose wallpaper with lace curtains. I think I remember these things because I love them too. When I was going to college at USU, I got to spend some time with her when she lived at the Williamsburg retirement home. She would tell me about when she was young and about Grandpa Neuffer. She always wanted to know about my life too. She had me make some potpourri sachets for her to give to her friends for Christmas. I'm so glad I had that opportunity to spend some time with her and get to know her more. She is an example to me of beauty and refinement. I love her very much and look forward to the day when I can spend more time with her.
Robert Hepburn Neuffer.
I have many wonderful memories of Grandma Neuffer. So many, in fact, that I find it difficult to write about them. However, I will try to do my best. First of all, my clearest and fondest memories come from my summers in Montana. Before I get to that, I remember that when I was 7 or 8 years of age, I spent 3 weeks in Reno, Nevada with Grandma and Grandpa. It was April, cold and gloomy. Grandma was living in a small apartment. There wasn't much to do, but I loved it. Grandma and Grandpa did their best to keep me entertained, but I never got bored. I had always felt safe, secure, and happy with them. Grandma would take me to the park often, and I would meet many new people. She always encouraged me to do that. Grandma Neuffer would also remind me that I represented the Neuffers and to treat people with respect and dignity. It helped me in many ways. I would play on the small deck for hours, or in the mornings before they had awakened I would build forts out of the cushions of the couch. I bring this event up to illustrate how special Grandma Neuffer was to me. As a parent, I know how children get restless easily and would have not do well in that situation, but with Grandma, Grandpa, and myself we always found our place. As I stated earlier, some of my fondest memories of Grandma Neuffer were in Montana. I grew up in that house on the hill. I remember when it was built, the smell of the fresh cut wood, the sounds of the saws and hammers and heat of the new attic. I remember the pain of an inch-long sliver in my hand and Grandma pulling it out with greatest of care while telling me to be a man about it. After the house was built, I would stay in the attic room except when thunderstorms shook the house. Grandma would let me sleep on the couch in the living room. She would leave her door open and make sure I was asleep before she fell asleep herself. Every summer I would marvel at the gardens filled with vegetables, fruits, and flowers. Every plant and tree would be watered each day. I loved to go out in the evenings and help Grandma tend to plants. Grandma expected and encouraged me to explore the property. I would spend hours down by the Kelly Creek playing by the bridge that my father had made. I would explore the gullies and underbrush and bring back tales of adventure to Grandma. She would listen with intense interest. When the trains would come by, Grandma would call me and sit with her grandson watching the train go by. Grandma and I would go walking in the evenings when it got cool. We would carry a weed cutter. I would attack the thistle bushes everywhere we found them. I remember her meals she would cook. They were never fancy, but always delicious. I could at night drink some postum with some watermelon or ice cream for dessert. Of all the things I remember about Grandma Neuffer was our talks. She loved a good story. Always willing to laugh. Grandma always listened to me. She never shooed me off or discounted what I had to say. She was intensely proud and filled with love for her family. Grandma expected good and proper behavior, but in return she gave a lot. I will always cherish her. I will give her the best honor I can by telling my children about Grandma and Grandpa Neuffer.